In 1945, the most powerful nation on Earth reached a conclusion it never intended the public to hear. The war in Europe was ending. Nazi Germany was collapsing. Cities were in ruins, armies were exhausted, and millions of soldiers were preparing to go home. Across the United States, church bells rang, factories slowed, and newspapers spoke openly about peace, reconstruction, and a new world order built on cooperation. But behind closed doors, inside secure rooms where no journalists were allowed and no speeches were written, American intelligence analysts were coming to a far darker understanding. They believed that another conflict was already taking shape, not years in the future, not generations away, but beginning almost immediately. This conclusion was not emotional. It was not political theater. It was not based on speeches or propaganda posters. It came from cold analysis, from numbers, from patterns, from years of observation. And once written down, it became one of the most dangerous documents of the post-war world. The report did not ask whether the United States and the Soviet Union would clash. It asked when. Publicly, the Soviet Union was still an ally. American newspapers printed photographs of smiling leaders standing shoulder to shoulder. The Red Army was praised for its sacrifice. Soviet losses were acknowledged with respect. On the surface, history seemed to be moving toward cooperation. Privately, U.S. intelligence saw something else entirely. They saw a power that had not demobilized its thinking, a system that did not interpret peace the same way the West did, an ally whose long-term objectives made direct conflict almost unavoidable. The analysts understood something unsettling. The end of World War II did not mean the end of strategic competition. It meant the removal of a common enemy, and once that enemy disappeared, the contradictions that had been temporarily buried would rise to the surface. This was not a report written in panic. There was no dramatic language, no exaggeration. In fact, its tone was disturbingly calm. That calmness made it more frightening, because calm analysis leaves no room for hope. The document began by stripping away illusions. It treated the alliance with the Soviet Union not as a friendship, but as a temporary alignment of interests. It made one assumption very clear. The USSR had entered the war not to preserve democracy, not to maintain balance, and not to return Europe to its pre-war state. It had entered to secure its own future, a future defined by power, territory, and ideological survival. From the American perspective, victory meant stability. From the Soviet perspective, victory meant opportunity. That difference mattered more than any battlefield success. The report warned that American policymakers were making a critical mistake. They were projecting their own values onto a system that did not share them. They assumed exhaustion would lead to cooperation. They believed economic recovery would soften political ambitions. They expected gratitude for wartime aid. The analysts believed all of those assumptions were wrong. They argued that the Soviet system had been shaped by decades of insecurity, invasion, and internal control. Its leadership did not measure safety by goodwill or treaties, but by buffers, dominance, and the absence of rivals. From that perspective, a strong, united, and economically powerful United States was not a partner. It was a future threat. And threats, in Soviet strategic thinking, were not ignored. They were managed, gradually, methodically, without haste. One of the most unsettling conclusions in the report was that the Soviet Union did not need to rush. Time worked in its favor. Western societies were demobilizing. Their populations were tired. Their armies were shrinking. Their political systems were noisy, divided, and slow. The Soviet system, by contrast, was centralized, disciplined, and accustomed to sacrifice. The analysts warned that while Americans were celebrating the end of war, Soviet planners were already studying the next phase of global competition. Not a hot war, not yet, but a struggle that would be fought through influence, pressure, and strategic positioning. The report emphasized that this approach made the Soviet Union especially dangerous, not because it was reckless, but because it was patient. It did not seek immediate confrontation. It sought irreversible advantage. The analysts examined Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe and saw a pattern forming. Control was being established, not through dramatic invasions, but through political manipulation, security agreements, and the gradual elimination of opposition. Each move could be defended as defensive. Each step appeared reasonable in isolation. Taken together, they formed something else entirely: a long-term expansion of power. The report warned that once this process was complete, reversing it would be extraordinarily difficult without force. And by that point, force would carry unimaginable risks. This was the core danger identified by American intelligence in 1945. The Soviet Union did not need to fire the first shot to win. It only needed to reshape the post-war world before the United States fully understood what was happening. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the report was its assessment of inevitability. The analysts did not believe personal diplomacy could change the trajectory. They did not believe leadership changes would alter the system's fundamental behavior. They did not believe goodwill gestures would be interpreted as strength. They believed they would be interpreted as weakness. From their perspective, the clash between the United States and the Soviet Union was not driven by personalities. It was driven by incompatible worldviews. One relied on openness, markets, and pluralism. The other relied on control, security, and ideological conformity. Both believed their system had to survive, and only one could dominate the post-war world. By the time the report reached the highest levels of government, its message was clear. Peace was real, but temporary. Cooperation was possible, but limited. Conflict was not guaranteed tomorrow, but it was built into the structure of the relationship. This document was not meant to inspire fear, it was meant to prevent surprise. Because the greatest danger, the analysts believed, was not Soviet aggression itself, but America's failure to recognize it in time. To understand why American intelligence believed conflict was unavoidable, the report did not begin with weapons or armies. It began with psychology. The analysts argued that the Soviet Union could not be understood as a normal nation-state. It did not respond to incentives the way Western governments did. It did not define security the same way, and it did not separate ideology from strategy. In their assessment, this misunderstanding was the single greatest weakness on the American side. The Soviet system, they wrote, was shaped by a permanent sense of encirclement. Decades of invasion, civil war, and internal purges had produced a leadership culture obsessed with control. Survival was not assumed, it was constantly defended. From this perspective, trust was not a foundation for peace, it was a vulnerability. The report emphasized that Soviet leaders viewed international politics as a zero-sum struggle. Gains by one side were losses for the other. Neutrality was temporary. Alliances were tools. And compromise was often a sign of tactical retreat, not reconciliation. This worldview fundamentally clashed with American expectations. U.S. policymakers believed that shared sacrifice in war would create shared responsibility in peace. They believed that institutions, trade, and diplomacy could stabilize relations. They assumed that rational self-interest would limit expansion. The analysts warned that these assumptions did not apply. According to the report, Soviet ideology framed the world as divided into hostile camps. Capitalist powers were not simply competitors, they were existential threats. Even when cooperation occurred, it was seen as provisional, useful only until conditions changed. This meant that friendly gestures from the United States were unlikely to change Soviet objectives. At best, they would buy time. At worst, they would lower resistance. The report made a critical distinction that many policymakers missed. The Soviet Union did not measure success by immediate outcomes. It measured success by trajectory. Was its influence expanding or contracting? Was its security perimeter growing or shrinking? Were rival systems becoming stronger or weaker over time? Short-term setbacks were acceptable if long-term trends remained favorable. This way of thinking made Soviet behavior appear cautious on the surface, but relentless underneath. The analysts described a system that preferred indirect pressure to open confrontation. Political influence was favored over military action. Internal divisions in rival countries were opportunities to be exploited. Economic dependence was a strategic asset. The report warned that the Soviet Union excelled at operating below the threshold of war. This was not accidental, it was deliberate. Open conflict with the United States would be catastrophic. Soviet leaders understood this, but they also believed that direct war was unnecessary. If enough territory, resources, and political leverage could be secured without fighting, the balance of power would eventually tilt. From that point on, the risk of confrontation would shift, not in America's favor. The analysts paid special attention to how the Soviet state viewed time. Democracies, they wrote, were constrained by elections, public opinion, and short political cycles. Long-term sacrifice was difficult to sustain. Strategic patience was fragile. The Soviet system had no such constraints. Its leadership could plan decades ahead. It could absorb hardship, it could suppress dissent, and it could maintain a single strategic direction without interruption. This asymmetry mattered more than military strength. The report argued that the Soviet Union did not need to outproduce or outspend the United States immediately. It only needed to outlast it. That insight led to one of the report's most unsettling conclusions. The greatest Soviet advantage was not ideology, territory, or even force. It was endurance. The analysts also rejected the idea that the Soviet Union was primarily reactive. They believed it actively shaped conditions to provoke favorable outcomes. Crises were not always avoided. They were sometimes engineered. Tension created leverage. Uncertainty created openings. From this perspective, stability itself could be a tool, used selectively, withdrawn strategically. The report warned that American leaders were likely to misread Soviet caution as restraint, and Soviet restraint as goodwill. In reality, both were tactical. This misreading, the analysts believed, would lead the United States to lower its guard at precisely the wrong moment. Perhaps the most dangerous misunderstanding addressed in the report concerned leadership. Many believed that Stalin's death or a change in personnel could soften Soviet behavior. The analysts strongly disagreed. They argued that the system would outlive any individual. Personalities mattered far less than structure. The incentives, fears, and objectives embedded in the Soviet state would continue regardless of who occupied the top positions. Expecting fundamental change through diplomacy alone was unrealistic. The report's assessment was blunt. As long as the Soviet system existed in its current form, strategic conflict with the United States was built in, not because war was desired, but because coexistence without dominance was unacceptable. This conclusion forced a painful realization. The problem facing the United States was not temporary hostility or post-war confusion. It was structural opposition. And structural problems do not solve themselves. They escalate, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. After dismantling illusions about partnership and goodwill, the report moved to its most serious judgment. This was the point where analysis turned into warning. The analysts stated, in careful but unmistakable language, that long-term peaceful coexistence between the United States and the Soviet Union was unlikely. Not difficult, not fragile, unlikely. This conclusion did not rest on any single action or decision. It was based on the accumulation of patterns. Every observation pointed in the same direction. Soviet behavior during the war, Soviet actions immediately after it, and the internal logic of the system itself all reinforced one idea. The Soviet Union would continue to expand its influence as long as opportunities existed. And opportunities, the analysts believed, were everywhere. Europe was devastated, governments were weak, economies were broken, political movements were fragmented and desperate. In that environment, influence did not require invasion. It required presence, leverage, and persistence. The report emphasized that the Soviet Union preferred methods that avoided direct confrontation. Military force was a last resort, not a first option. Political pressure, security agreements, intelligence penetration, and control over local institutions were far more effective. Each advance could be justified as defensive. Each move could be explained as temporary. Each step could be denied as expansion. But the direction was always the same. The analysts warned that the greatest danger was not a sudden Soviet attack. It was a slow transformation of the post-war order that would leave the United States strategically isolated before it realized what had happened. Once influence was consolidated, reversing it would be extraordinarily costly. This led to one of the most uncomfortable insights in the report. Time favored the Soviet Union more than the United States. American society was transitioning from wartime urgency to peacetime exhaustion. Soldiers were returning home. Industries were retooling. Voters demanded stability and prosperity, not confrontation. The appetite for prolonged tension was limited. The Soviet system did not share these constraints. Its leadership was accustomed to hardship. Its population was controlled. Its political direction was fixed. Delay did not weaken resolve. It strengthened it. The analysts believed that Soviet leaders would exploit this asymmetry relentlessly. They also rejected the idea that economic cooperation alone could prevent conflict. Trade and aid might slow Soviet expansion, but they would not alter its objectives. In some cases, they might even strengthen Soviet capacity while lowering Western vigilance. The report warned against confusing engagement with influence. Another critical conclusion concerned deterrence. The analysts argued that traditional military superiority was not enough. The Soviet Union did not need to defeat the United States militarily to succeed. It only needed to avoid defeat while shifting the balance of power incrementally. This meant that waiting for clear aggression before responding would be a mistake. By the time aggression was obvious, it might be too late. The report's language grew increasingly stark. It suggested that the United States faced a choice it was reluctant to acknowledge. Either it would actively shape the post-war world, or it would gradually lose the ability to do so. Neutrality, withdrawal, or complacency were not stable options. The analysts did not predict immediate war. In fact, they believed the Soviet Union would avoid open conflict for as long as possible. But this made the situation more dangerous, not less. A prolonged struggle without clear boundaries would test American patience, unity, and strategic clarity. The report warned that failure in this environment would not come suddenly. It would come quietly. Through compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. Through concessions justified as temporary. Through underestimation of long-term consequences. Perhaps the most sobering line in the analysis was its rejection of optimism. The analysts did not believe that goodwill could overcome structural rivalry. They did not believe that shared wartime experience created lasting alignment. They did not believe that declarations of peaceful intent reflected final objectives. They believed that power, not intention, would determine outcomes. And in a world reshaped by war, power was fluid. The report concluded this section with an implicit warning to American leadership. The post-war period was not a return to normalcy. It was a transition into a new form of conflict. One that would be less visible, more complex, and more difficult to explain to the public. The danger was not that Americans would choose the wrong strategy. The danger was that they would refuse to believe a strategy was needed at all. After outlining the nature of the Soviet threat, the report turned its focus inward. This was where the analysis became most uncomfortable. The analysts argued that the greatest weakness facing the United States in the post-war world was not military, economic, or technological. It was psychological. America was exhausted. Years of total war had reshaped the nation. Industries had been pushed to their limits. Families had endured loss and separation. Entire communities had been mobilized around a single objective: victory. Now that victory had been achieved, there was an overwhelming desire to return to normal life. The report warned that this desire would shape policy more than strategy. Demobilization was already underway. Troop numbers were shrinking rapidly. Wartime production was slowing. Public pressure to reduce spending and avoid foreign entanglements was growing. The political climate favored reassurance, not confrontation. The analysts understood why. They also understood the risk. They argued that democratic societies struggle with prolonged ambiguity. Clear enemies and defined wars create unity. Slow, indirect competition creates fatigue, doubt, and division. The kind of struggle the Soviet Union was likely to pursue would exploit these weaknesses relentlessly. The report emphasized that American political institutions were designed for transparency and debate. These were strengths in peacetime. In a prolonged strategic rivalry, they could become liabilities. Decisions would be delayed. Consensus would be difficult. Short-term concerns would often override long-term planning. The Soviet system faced none of these obstacles. Its leadership did not need public approval. It did not need electoral victories. It did not need to justify sacrifice. Strategic direction could remain constant even as conditions changed. The analysts warned that this asymmetry would place the United States at a disadvantage over time. Another vulnerability identified in the report was overconfidence. The United States had emerged from the war economically strengthened and militarily dominant. There was a widespread belief that no rival could match its industrial capacity or global reach. The analysts cautioned against this mindset. They argued that superiority in resources did not guarantee superiority in outcomes. The Soviet Union did not need to match American strength directly. It only needed to exploit moments of distraction, hesitation, and division. The report also warned of a deeper danger: moral fatigue. After years of fighting tyranny, Americans wanted to believe that the world had learned its lesson. There was a strong desire to see the war as a final chapter rather than a transition. This made it emotionally difficult to accept the idea of a new adversary, especially one that had just been an ally. The analysts believed this reluctance would delay necessary decisions. They noted that American leaders would face pressure to downplay tensions, avoid alarming the public, and emphasize cooperation. While politically understandable, this approach carried strategic costs. Silence would not slow Soviet expansion. Optimism would not alter Soviet objectives. Delay would not improve America's position. The report stressed that early recognition of the problem was essential. Once the Soviet Union consolidated influence in key regions, the cost of countering it would rise dramatically. Preventive action was easier than reversal. Yet preventive action required public support, and public support required honesty. This created a dilemma the analysts did not attempt to resolve. They simply documented it. Another vulnerability lay in America's global responsibilities. The war had left the United States with unprecedented influence and obligations. Maintaining stability across multiple regions would strain resources and attention. Any retreat would create openings. Any inconsistency would be exploited. The analysts believed the Soviet Union understood this perfectly. They would not challenge the United States everywhere at once. They would probe. They would test responses. They would advance where resistance was weakest. The report warned that failure to respond decisively in one area would have consequences far beyond that region. Perception mattered as much as capability. Each concession signaled limits. Each hesitation invited pressure elsewhere. By the end of this section, the message was clear. America's greatest vulnerability was not a lack of power. It was a lack of readiness for a conflict that did not look like war. A struggle without declarations, without front lines, without a clear ending. If the United States failed to adapt to this reality, the analysts believed, it would find itself reacting rather than shaping events. And in such a conflict, reaction was the path to decline. Having outlined both the nature of the Soviet challenge and America's vulnerabilities, the report turned to its most practical question: what should be done? The analysts were careful. They did not propose dramatic ultimatums or immediate confrontation. They understood the risks of escalation, but they were equally clear that passivity was not a strategy. The central recommendation of the report was simple in principle and complex in execution. The United States must actively shape the post-war balance of power. This meant abandoning the assumption that stability would emerge naturally. It would not. Stability had to be constructed, defended, and maintained. The report argued that American policy should be guided by long-term objectives rather than short-term calm. Temporary reductions in tension were meaningless if they came at the cost of strategic position. Peace, the analysts warned, could not be measured by the absence of conflict alone. It had to be measured by the direction of change. One of the most important recommendations concerned presence. The analysts believed that American withdrawal from key regions would create vacuums the Soviet Union would inevitably fill. Maintaining influence required visibility, commitment, and credibility. This did not always mean military force. In many cases, economic support, political engagement, and institutional backing were more effective. But these tools only worked if they were sustained. The report warned against symbolic gestures unsupported by long-term commitment. Short bursts of aid or attention would fail. Consistency was essential. Another recommendation addressed alliances. The analysts argued that isolated nations were vulnerable nations. Collective security arrangements would be necessary to counterbalance Soviet influence. No single country, including the United States, could manage the post-war environment alone. This idea was controversial at the time. Many Americans favored disengagement. The report pushed in the opposite direction. It argued that American security was now inseparable from global stability. The analysts also stressed the importance of clarity. Ambiguity in intentions invited miscalculation. The Soviet Union, they believed, respected strength and consistency more than conciliation. This did not mean provocation. It meant predictability. If American red lines were unclear, they would be tested. If responses were inconsistent, pressure would increase. Deterrence depended on credibility, not rhetoric. The report addressed the role of military power with caution. Force was necessary, but it was not sufficient. Over-reliance on military solutions would be costly and politically unsustainable. The Soviet challenge required a comprehensive approach. Economic strength, technological leadership, and political cohesion were just as important. The analysts warned that internal division was the most dangerous outcome. A society unsure of its purpose could not sustain a long struggle. Public understanding, while difficult to achieve, was ultimately unavoidable. This recommendation was among the most sensitive. How could leaders prepare the public for a prolonged conflict without creating panic or backlash? The report offered no easy answers. It only emphasized that deception was not a solution. Perhaps the most forward-looking aspect of the report was its recognition that this struggle would not have a clear endpoint. There would be no surrender ceremony, no final treaty. Victory would be defined by endurance and influence rather than decisive battles. This required a fundamental shift in thinking. The report concluded that the United States must accept a new role in the world, not as a temporary leader, but as a permanent stabilizing force. Retreat was no longer an option without consequences. The analysts understood how difficult this would be to accept. They also believed it was unavoidable. If the United States failed to act, the post-war order would not remain neutral. It would be shaped by someone else. In the years that followed, the warnings in the report stopped being theoretical. They became observable. Almost every major development of the early post-war period followed the trajectory the analysts had outlined. What had once appeared cautious and speculative began to look precise. Eastern Europe was the first confirmation. One by one, governments across the region shifted. Elections were influenced. Opposition parties were marginalized. Security services were reorganized. Each change was presented as temporary, necessary, or protective. Together, they transformed the political landscape. The Soviet Union did not announce a new empire. It denied having one. It framed its actions as defensive measures against instability and reactionary forces. To outside observers, each step could be debated. None alone justified confrontation, but the pattern was unmistakable. By the time the pattern was widely recognized, it was largely irreversible. The report had predicted this exact problem. Influence consolidated quietly would be far more difficult to challenge than open aggression. Protests, diplomatic pressure, and economic incentives would come too late once control had been institutionalized. Another confirmation came with the hardening of divisions in Europe. What had been wartime cooperation gave way to suspicion, then to separation. Borders that had once been administrative became ideological. The line was not drawn overnight. It emerged gradually, as predicted. The analysts had warned that once this division solidified, it would define international politics for decades. That warning proved accurate. The Cold War did not begin with a declaration. It emerged through accumulation. The report's assessment of Soviet patience also proved correct. Rather than risking immediate confrontation, Soviet strategy focused on endurance. Crises were managed carefully. Pressure was applied incrementally. Provocations were calibrated. This approach confused many observers at the time. Was the Soviet Union aggressive or cautious, expansionist or defensive? The answer, as the report had explained, was both. Caution was the method. Expansion was the objective. The analysts had also warned that American hesitation would invite pressure. Early uncertainty about commitment in certain regions created openings. Where responses were slow or ambiguous, Soviet influence expanded. Where resistance was firm and sustained, expansion slowed. This pattern reinforced one of the report's central conclusions: clarity mattered. Another striking confirmation involved ideology. The report had argued that Soviet actions would be justified in moral and political terms that masked strategic goals. This proved accurate as well. Expansion was framed as liberation. Control was described as stability. Opposition was labeled subversion. Language became a tool. The analysts had warned that accepting these narratives at face value would lead to miscalculation. Understanding intent required examining outcomes, not rhetoric. By the late 1940s, the outlines of a new global struggle were clear. Alliances hardened. Institutions formed. Military planning resumed. What had been unthinkable in 1945 became routine. The report had not predicted every event, but it had captured the direction of change with remarkable accuracy. This accuracy posed an uncomfortable question. If the warning had been so clear, why had it been so difficult to act decisively at the beginning? Part of the answer lay in politics, part lay in psychology, and part lay in the nature of the report itself. It was not written to persuade the public. It was written to inform those already burdened with decisions no one wanted to make. Despite its accuracy, the report remained buried for years. Not because it was flawed, not because it was exaggerated, but because releasing it would have changed the post-war world overnight. The analysts understood that their conclusions carried consequences far beyond strategy. This was not just an intelligence assessment, it was a psychological shock waiting to happen. In 1945, the American public was not prepared to hear that peace was temporary. Families were welcoming soldiers home, cities were rebuilding, the nation wanted closure. Any suggestion that another confrontation was already forming would have been seen as betrayal of that hope. Leaders understood this. The report challenged the central narrative of the moment, that the war had ended evil, restored balance, and secured the future. Admitting otherwise risked public backlash, political instability, and loss of trust. More importantly, it risked panic. The analysts warned that public fear could produce extreme outcomes. Calls for preemptive action, overreaction to minor crises, pressure for policies that could escalate rather than contain. The wrong reaction at the wrong time could turn prediction into provocation. Silence in that context was seen as restraint. There was also a diplomatic reason for secrecy. Publicly labeling the Soviet Union as a future adversary would have hardened positions immediately. Negotiations would collapse. Cooperative mechanisms would fail before they were tested. The fragile post-war environment could fracture beyond repair. The report was meant to guide internal planning, not public messaging. It was designed to shape quiet decisions, troop deployments, economic programs, alliance discussions, without forcing an immediate confrontation. In effect, it was a blueprint for preparation without alarm. Another reason for secrecy was uncertainty. While the analysts were confident in the trajectory, they could not predict exact outcomes. History rarely moves in straight lines. Publicly committing to a confrontational stance would remove flexibility. Leaders wanted room to adapt. The report was therefore treated as a warning, not a prophecy. But warnings lose power when they remain hidden. As years passed, policies emerged that mirrored the report's recommendations: containment, alliance building, economic reconstruction, sustained presence. Yet these actions were rarely explained in the stark terms the analysts had used. The public saw responses. They did not see the reasoning behind them. This gap created confusion. Why were troops still stationed abroad? Why were resources flowing to distant regions? Why was tension rising with a former ally? Without context, these actions seemed inconsistent. To those who had read the report, they were inevitable. The analysts had anticipated this problem as well. They warned that prolonged secrecy would erode public understanding. A conflict fought without explanation would eventually lose support. But revealing the full assessment too early carried its own risks. There was no perfect moment. By the time parts of the report were declassified, the world it described already existed. The Cold War was no longer a forecast, it was reality. The document became historical evidence rather than strategic guidance. Yet its conclusions remained unsettling. They revealed that the post-war order was never as stable as it appeared. That optimism had masked preparation. That beneath public celebrations, governments were planning for endurance, not peace. Perhaps most troubling was what the report implied about history itself. Major conflicts do not always begin with declarations. Sometimes they begin with analysis, with a quiet realization that two paths cannot converge. The report did not start the Cold War, it recognized it. And recognition, once delayed, carries a cost. The final lines of the report did not offer comfort. They offered clarity. The analysts understood that history rarely announces itself. It unfolds through choices that seem reasonable at the time, shaped by pressures that are easy to ignore until they accumulate. The post-war world was not the beginning of peace, it was the beginning of a test of endurance, a test of perception, a test of whether open societies could recognize danger without abandoning their values. The report's authors believe that the most dangerous moment in any conflict is not the first shot. It is the period before the shot, when intentions are debated, warnings are dismissed, and preparation feels unnecessary. That was the moment they were writing about. From their perspective, 1945 was not a year of resolution. It was a hinge in history. One direction led toward deliberate engagement and long-term stability. The other led toward gradual erosion and reaction. There was no neutral path. Looking back, the report reads less like speculation and more like an early map of the world that followed. The division of Europe, the rise of competing alliances, the normalization of permanent tension. All of it was present in embryo. What makes the document unsettling is not that it predicted conflict. It is that it understood why conflict could be delayed without being prevented. Delay created the illusion of peace. Illusion reduced urgency. Reduced urgency shaped policy. The analysts believed that the true danger was complacency born of hope. Hope that the war had solved the underlying problem. Hope that systems with opposing foundations could coexist without friction. Hope, in this case, was not a strategy. The echo of 1945 is not found in any single event. It is found in a pattern, the repeated tendency to mistake temporary stability for resolution, to believe that absence of crisis equals safety. The report reminds us that power shifts quietly before it shifts violently. By the time conflict becomes obvious, the decisive moments have often passed. The war that ended in 1945 closed one chapter of history. The conflict that followed opened another. One without a clear beginning, without a clear end, and without simple victories. The analysts who wrote this report did not claim to control the future. They only insisted that ignoring structure would not change it. The lesson they left behind is uncomfortable but enduring. History does not move toward peace by default. It moves in the direction it is pushed. And when no one is pushing, it moves anyway.